Now that we have seen the concept of responsive breakpoints, let's put them to use creating a layout for a web page. Currently we have 3 divs, each with a header and placeholder text, and they are stacked right on top of one another. We'd like to rearrange these into columns that take up about a third of the page. And when we display this page on a mobile phone, we'd like them to collapse back to a single column, again stacked one on top of another. We're going to explore several strategies for accomplishing this. The first of those is going to be float-based layouts. This is an older strategy for creating columns, and it's based on the float CSS property, which is traditionally used to float images and figures to the right or the left of the body of text, much like you've probably seen in magazines. Let's go ahead and give it a try. First, in our index.cshtml, we are going to have to add a way of knowing that these are going to be treated as columns. So we could either add a class directly to each of these columns, or because they are inside a single containing div, we could actually attach the class there. Let's go ahead and do that, and we'll call our class float columns in reference of the strategy we're going to be using. Then we have to jump to the site CSS, and we're going to select those individual divs. So we can go from the float columns to their children, which are divs. So this particular selector is the child selector. It looks at a div, in this case, that is a direct descendant or direct child of the float columns container, which is also a div. So this is actually going to be looking at this div, and this div, and this div. And because it's a direct child, it will only look at that level. It won't look at any divs that are nested further down. If we used a space instead, that means ancestry, and then we'd also be looking at any divs deeper down that tree. So this will apply only to those 3 divs that are direct descendants of the float column div. We'll go ahead and set their float properties to left, so that they float to the left. We'll set their width to 33%, which is going to make it approximately a third of the available space. We'll go ahead and run this. And you can see we now have our 3-column layout. However, if we scroll down to the bottom, we're going to notice a bit of a problem. And that is caused by the nature of the float command. What it does is it interrupts the normal flow layout process that a web page uses to decide where things are. And in this case, the last element that we laid out is this one here, and that is treated as the bottom of our containing div, whereas this one is actually longer, so it's extended further beyond. You can see other problems as well, depending on where these columns fall out. Sometimes elements will actually end up floating to the side that are intended to be beneath and that kind of thing. So we need to fix this. And the traditional way of doing that is to use a technique called a clear fix. So there is a CSS rule called clear that can take both a left or right, and it will stop elements from floating on that particular side of this element. So we can set that clear, and usually we'll actually set both, so it will stop elements that floating from the left and elements floating from the right, and it will basically just restore the normal flow layout. We have to also apply this class to an element in our actual page, and usually we'll do that after, say, this container with the float columns. So we'll set this new div we have to create its class to clear fix. And we'll save both of those. If we run this again, and if we scroll down, we'll see now our footer is appearing beneath all of the columns like we would expect. Now there's a couple other things that we might not like. If we look at this column, notice how tight it is up against this column and how some of the words, especially like right here, almost look like they're flowing from one column to another. So we could add some CSS padding and some other things to try to space those out a little bit more and make it a little bit more legible. But this is the basic technique. Now if we look at it as though we're looking at it on a cell phone, and let's pick maybe a pixel, notice that it's still doing the 3 columns and probably is going to be a lot harder to read on the smaller screen. So we want to make this responsive. So we'll go back to our site CSS, and we're going to add an @media rule. And we'll have this media rule apply when our max width is less than, say, 490. And actually, we already have a media rule up here that does exactly that. So we can actually just take this rule, but we have to have it appear after the float rules are set up, because it needs to be able to override those. We'll go ahead and leave the aside in there, and we will add another rule for float columns div. So this selector is exactly the same as this selector, because these are the rules we want to override. And we're going to set float to none, so it no longer will try to float these. And then we also have to set their width back to 100% so that it takes up all the available space. And this should make it work exactly as it did when we first looked at the page. So we have our 3 columns if the browser is at its normal size, and if we switch to a phone, notice that our columns go back to being stacked one after another.